Hi, this is Michael Martin talking about Sophiology here in my barn. I might be interrupted by my dog eventually. But I think a barn's as good a place to start as any because the barn is kind of the place between the house and nature. And it's where house and nature meet in a way. And so the household and nature meet in Sophiology as well. I mean, the household of God, the household of human beings. And the difficult thing about Sophiology is defining it. And it's not that coming up with a definition is difficult, but what's difficult is definitions as definitions. Because once you have a definition, people get a solidified concept of what a thing is, which no longer allows it to live. I'm reminded of Rudolf Steiner, who I quote quite a bit in my work. He had a wonderful thing about his anthroposophy. He's quoted as saying from somebody, I heard it, that he wishes every day he'd come up with a new name for anthroposophy because people get stuck to the concept of the name. And I think Sophiology is the same thing because we get stuck to the name. We get stuck to our assumption of what it means. So to put it as simply as possible, I have to say that Sophiology is where science, art, and mysticism meet and become one. And that's about as precise as I'd like to be. And that's why through all of my books on Sophiology, I mean, there's a theological component, there's a philosophical component, the arts come into it as well as science. And what's important about this is that Sophiology, at least as I understand it, is a retrieval of sorts. It's as Adrian Pabst calls it in the foreword to the Submerged Reality, it's an alternative modernity. And I think that's really the perfect way to describe it because we've all grown up in Western civilization and with this Enlightenment paradigm, or these revolutions, the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the Industrial Revolution, all these moments of so-called progress. And Sophiology, as an alternate modernity, says no, we got it wrong. This secularization of everything, starting from Descartes, well, actually starting from the nominalists in the late Middle Ages, but exacerbated by René Descartes and the pure nature philosophies and theologies of the early modern period. They complicated, actually they didn't complicate, they oversimplified reality by ignoring half of reality, which is the supernatural, saying that the supernatural really has nothing to do, in a way, with our experience of nature or art. And we see this keep progressing through into the 20th, 21st centuries, where by that point, nature is just a thing to be experimented upon and exploited. It's no longer something with which we participate. And Sophiology, going back to the 17th century for sure, argues that that's wrong. I mean, Sophiology says no. There is a participation that we all undertake with creation, that the liturgy does not stop at when you leave the church. The liturgy is ongoing. There's a continual commerce between human beings and spiritual beings in everything we do. And the funny thing is the people who, after the 17th century, would say these kinds of things were dismissed as dreamers or kooks or romantics, whereas that was the default position prior to that. And it's in human culture up until the scientific revolution and after. That was the default position, that we participate in this. That God's present everywhere. Now, how does this happen? How do people become disenfranchised from their own environment, from their own world? And what they do is they create their own little worlds. We've said that you're in your own little world. So we create these own little worlds that are not connected to reality. And Sophiology tries to connect us to reality, and doesn't say try, connects us to reality. And this is present in the Platonic idea of the world soul, for instance, or Mother Nature, right? But in the Old Testament, this is present in the idea of Sophia, or wisdom, Hokmah, who speaks in Proverbs 8 and 9, who participates with God in the creation of all things. And God, as it says in Sirach, pours his wisdom out over all of his creations. So that's part of what we have to start with from Sophiology. And it's interesting, though, because there are arguments that the Sophia of Proverbs and the wisdom books is really a personification, and some of the early church fathers associated wisdom with Christ, because of St. John's Gospel, where the Logos creates all of the world. But in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom speaks and says, "I was with him at the beginning of all things." And you can also say that when you look at Genesis and the creation of Adam and Eve, where God says, "Let us create man in our image," that there's one way to interpret that as God's speaking as Trinity, but another way to think about that is God speaking to wisdom. Let us create man in our image, male and female created he them, right? So I think that's important to think about. Now, it's interesting, though, when I wrote The Submerged Reality, I was not at all familiar with Margaret Barker's work. Margaret Barker is a Methodist theologian and Old Testament scholar, and she's come up with this thesis that in the First Temple Judaism, this is before King Josiah, that wisdom, or Hokmah in Hebrew, was a part of Jewish worship. She was, I don't know exactly, and I don't think Barker does either, how that worked out, but it's clear to Barker that she was expelled from the temple. And it's interesting, though, that with its expulsion from the temple, around that time, there was a Jewish community in northern Africa, in Alexandria, where the wisdom books come from. And the wisdom books are not included in the Protestant or Hebrew canons because they were written in Greek, but they are included in the Catholic and Orthodox canons of Scripture. And it's interesting that that's where the strongest indications outside of Proverbs are indicated about the importance of wisdom in Old Testament understanding. So it's interesting if I ever do a second edition of the Submerged Reality, I have to alter that bit in the introduction where I talk about how I'm displeased with some scholars who try to talk about wisdom as the lady who was kicked out of the temple. Because it's true, though, that most of the research I've seen that it indicated that before it was a speculative, though Barker makes a really strong case that based on Scripture and redactions of Scripture, that's exactly what happened. So if I ever do a second edition, that I'll have to adjust that a little bit, because I think that's probably true. So anyway, going back to Sophia and Sophiology, this is a philosophy, a theology, a way of viewing the world that includes nature, includes the physical, along with the spiritual. It's not a bifurcated universe. It's a united universe, which is very, really implicit in Catholic and Orthodox theologies that this is one, right? And you can see this also in the understanding of sacraments, right? These physical substances which are conveyors of grace, right? And it's the same thing with we all detect this. We all see this. We've all had experiences of nature where we felt grace revealed itself to us, or we felt touched by grace. We've all had experiences with perhaps music or art or poetry where you felt something of profound meaning was disclosed to you. And this is what wisdom is. This is what Sophia is. It also happens in the sciences, you know? It's when we find ourselves astonished at the creation. You know, it's hard to avoid. It's hard to avoid. And this is why, you know, I think it's important, if you look through, I guess, the history of Sophiology after the New Testament, you know, a lot of the people who are associated with the Divine Sophia, say Jakob Burma, Jane Led, and John Portage of the Philadelphian Society, Vladimir Soloviev, and the other Russian Sophiologists, they all get kind of marginalized in their traditions. And in the greater tradition, the Western tradition, we could say, they are kind of sidelined as well as being just mystics or something like this. But the fact is this is what I mean by that alternate modernity. If we were to follow Jakob Burma to the Philadelphians, and also, you could also, I think there's a strong element of Burma and in Sophiology in Rosicrucian writings, and especially in the writing of Thomas Vaughan, who was an Anglican priest and alchemist, and the twin brother of Henry Vaughan, the metaphysical poet. And Henry Vaughan, his work is extraordinarily sophiological, because there you see in Vaughan's work and in his brother's work, there is a rejection of the kind of scholastic, early modern bifurcation of spirit and matter, you know, that came from pure nature, you know. And what they're saying is no, and Henry Vaughan in particular, that nature, scripture, the human person, they're all united. Which is why in Henry Vaughan's poetry, for instance, some early critics would point to him as a kind of romantic poet before there were romantic poets. But that's not what he was. He was actually, he was Welsh, and he really had a relationship to nature. You see, nature in his poetry is a real thing, but it's a real thing that discloses spiritual realities, where you don't get that from other poets. Even Shakespeare doesn't talk much about nature, you know, other than as a kind of symbol for something. But for Henry Vaughan, nature is a vessel that discloses divinity, if we only have the eyes to attune to it. And I think we'll probably close this video with this. So how do we come upon this intuition of the wisdom of God or of Sophia in things? And the only way I know is by attention. And Simone Weil said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And so how do we pay attention, right? How do we contemplate? And so here's the thing, is to be present to something, to be absolutely present to it. Now, it doesn't matter if it's nature, you know, a leaf even. Goethe was big on this. A leaf, a garden, a flower, a sunset, color, or in that science, or we're attentive in meaningful ways to music or a poem, and that we're present to it. You know, you're not analyzing it. You can't use your intellect to do this. You have to be present to it. And maybe it's the point where your intellect lets go and you enter into it. And by entering into the phenomenon before you, it enters into you, and that reciprocity kind of recapitulates a sophiological event. You could point to the incarnation of Christ as a sophiological event because being born of the Virgin Mary, a spiritual reality became physical. So that's why in Burma and others, the Virgin Mary is kind of the incarnated Sophia. She makes God's grace present in the world. So I ask that as you go through this course, and you even go through life, to be attentive to phenomena. I mean, you can't do it 24 hours a day, but you can take some time each day to be attentive to something. And in the Catholic tradition, Thomas Keating and others talk about practicing the presence of God. So that's one way to think about it. But it's also being attentive to the creation and to works of creation. Now, a little caveat, right? So the problem is, not everything will reward you with a Sophianic insight. If you're attentive to pornography, you're going to have a very different experience. It's not going to be a disclosure of wisdom or beauty. It'll be something diabolical, really. This requires us to turn our attention to that which is good, because only in that which is good can the good be revealed. And so we'll continue next time.